Hello, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Pro Dignity No Doubt. I am your hostess, Nicole Smith. If you've been with me for a while, I guess you probably figured that out by now. But anyway, so it's another gloomy day here in Franklin, Tennessee, and likely you'll hear the sounds of progress in the background, i.e., construction, which seems like it's a never-ending thing. So anyway, today we're actually going to sort of provide the bookend to our last episode, and this being a very special episode because it's our final episode for season 2. So before we dive into the topic of the day, I just really wanted to lay out the significance, I feel, of what has been the last few years of doing this podcast. And at the heart of it, it's been about obedience. Those who know me personally know that I am one that will openly speak her mind at any turn. It is not something that is very challenging for me on a one-to-one basis. But when it comes to putting myself out there into the ethosphere, I don't know, it's been a harder sell for me on a personal basis. As outgoing as I am, I tend to be one that would just rather skip the whole business of putting myself out into public. But a few years ago, I felt deeply compelled and then lived in disobedience for quite a few years to God's call to speak. And this podcast was a lot about living, as much about living in obedience as it was about getting the truth to the public about the reality that we're living in. And so last episode, we obviously talked about this idea, this framework of what it means to be pro-dignity and the role it plays in the larger cultural discussion of human value, justice, compassion, i.e., whatever. And for those of who have been with me for the last several seasons, it definitely started out with 100% being an interview-based podcast. And the vision behind that was that a lot of times within culture, we throw away human value at the point in which life becomes challenging. And the stories of the individuals that I interviewed were very broad spectrum stories. So you'd have somebody that was enslaved in Cambodia during the 70s, which was a wild story, to somebody that had been trafficked by her grandfather, somebody that had been in a cult, all the way to like chronic illness, to having a spinal injury and becoming paraplegic. I mean, like, they were very broad spectrum stories. And the reality of life on this earth is that's just it. Like, you can make choices, other people can make choices, and Mother Nature herself can come for you. And life's just really, really hard. And the heart of that was the intention of showing that a person who went through unspeakable tragedy could actually come out on the other end and become an advocate for the reality that they imprisoned them almost for years of their life. And that's the reality of life, but also that there is another side to it. There is a value in that in those experiences and the impact those stories can have in culture at large, But really, there was a disconnect forming, and I started getting questions really about, what this podcast was supposed to do missionally. And the point really became very clear that there needed to be sort of a refocus in how we conducted this. And so it no longer became about me exposing and allowing people to have a voice around their story. And we still do. Obviously, this season we've had some pretty strong stories that have been heard as well. But yeah, so thus the transition into a episode format that are shorter, they're educational, they're meant to sort of educate around the different aspects of this pro-dignity framework, and it's a big part of our mission. So as an organization, for those who, again, don't know, Dignity Defense Institute, we partner with, and this is supposed to be a big aspect of our education arm. So, but essentially, with all that being said, I really want to highlight that this final episode of this season will be followed by a third season. There might be an expansion of this format. We might do something different, but this is what I felt like God was calling this podcast to become for this season. So getting into this discussion. So if you joined us the last episode, you know that we kind of laid the foundation for what we call the pro-dignity framework, and essentially a way of seeing and speaking about life that goes beyond the slogans and the partisan categories that are very heavy, and specifically the pro-life, pro-abortion space. And it was really about reclaiming, this movement is about reclaiming human worth at every stage. And so today we want to take that foundation we laid in the last episode, and we really want to expand upon it and build upon it. And I titled this episode From Crisis to Connection, and How Radical Community Can Heal the Dignity Gap. And I guess you're probably asking, what's a dignity gap? I can actually speak, but it's a space, that essentially the space between what we say we believe about human worth and about what we actually do. So how we actually treat people. It's when we advocate for life in the womb, but somehow in the busyness of life, we forget to actually be there for the mom who's actually living in the car with her 2 toddlers. Because we say that life matters, but it becomes challenging to actually show up for that elderly neighbor or the disabled coworker, or it doesn't even have to be extreme. Somebody that's depressed, like a depressed coworker or whatever. So essentially, pro-dignity invites us to kind of close that gap, and the importance of being at the intersection of statements and actions, because there is a lot of critique that if you defend life in the womb, that typically we don't do much for the circumstances, a lot like those stories that we've told on this podcast for years now that are really challenging, and people feel like they're going through life and challenges alone because life's really hard. We're very well aware of that. But at the heart, what we're doing is it's not just about words, about action. And human dignity, as we've stated very many times on this podcast, is not only the foundation for justice, it's also the foundation for compassion. And if someone has no worth, then why would we actually show up to help them? Why would we sacrifice for the vulnerable? Why would we create systems to serve those that are in pain? The answer is we wouldn't, to be honest, which is why we have to start with this belief that every life is sacred, so that we cannot just demand justice, we can demand compassion. Actually, Genesis 1:27, we're going to dive into some verses this episode too. I just really want to be rooted in the word. And so Genesis 1:27 tells us, quote, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." In this verse, at its core, it holds the power to reshape how the entire conversation around justice, service, even social reform, as dirty as that word is, at times we do see things within our culture emerging that need change. Because once you know that a person bears the image of God, that you can't ignore them. And we live in a society that is so disconnected and so distracted because of digital media. It's an easy thing to happen because our lives are just so filled with busyness. Calendars are stacked, obligations that are really pressing in our personal and our business life. And in the middle of all that noise, it becomes nearly impossible to stop and see others around us that are hurting, let alone actually just serve them. Because sometimes we're even the hurting people ourselves, we all are actually, and we think, in the state of our hurting, that no one's actually helped us. So why would I help them? And honestly, I've dealt with that kind of bitterness myself, with my journey with my own daughter, and especially during COVID, where nobody could show up and people asked how they could help. And it was just one more task for me to figure out. I just wanted someone to show up and just do. Honestly, I just wanted to be seen enough for somebody to schedule a play date with me so I could talk to an adult person that was not my child, or couldn't focus on other things aside from another doctor's appointment or another therapy session. So, or, you're kind of in this place that I just don't have time, and I wouldn't even know how to help another person if I did have the time. And actually, just the other day, oddly enough, my daughter, Larianne, my oldest, and I were at Target, and I'm just chit-chatting with the cashier, and she's an older lady, and I inquired about her day and how she was doing, and then she just sort of randomly mentioned the fact that she really wished she could help address homelessness. And which I mean, yeah, like absolutely. It was kind of cool that she would bring such a thing up. And then with my daughter, had actually just completed a project where she had put together these bags for the homeless, and it had things like water and blankets, gum, basic necessities, but some fun things, small things, but just as a way to say you're seen. And the cashier paused and she smiled after my daughter sort of blurted this thing she'd done out, and she said, "You know what? You're right. Small acts really matter. And even if it just is to tell them that they are seen and somebody cared enough about them to do something small and special." So I was like, yeah, she's right. Those small things do matter. And in this world of busyness, it's hard to kind of put yourself into this place of we got to do something big and impactful, but you don't realize, like, from me and my own experience, like I was saying, those small things, like if you just shown up and with a cup of coffee and sat with me and chatted, that would have been enough to give rest to my soul. And really, at its core, dignity, it starts with a granola bar or a warm blanket or a kind word. It would have made a big difference in my life, but I know, because it would have made a big difference in my life, I know it would have made a big difference in others as well. And you can go a step further. You don't have to stay in the small things. You can go to the big things. If you have, God gives us callings and passions of our own, you know? So if you have a heart for the unborn, volunteer at a pregnancy center once a month. If you have a heart for the homeless, serve meals or donate socks, make a bag and give it out to somebody on the street. If you're passionate about foster care, serve something daily in those capacities. It doesn't even have to be daily, like it could be big, it could be small too, like I said. So radical community doesn't have to require perfection. It just requires presence in some capacity. And this is where, this whole pro dignity framework sort of moves us from belief to action, because we can't just close dignity gaps without proximity. We can't serve those we refuse to actually sit by. And again, another Bible verse I really wanted to touch on is that we see in the early church that the disciples, the early church, were living a radical lifestyle. So in Acts 2:42 through 47, quote, "They devoted themselves to the apostles, teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need." And that in some ways seems just like simple charity, but it was actually more. It was communion. It was sacrifice. It was relational. It was rooted in a shared dignity that we recognize. And this is what we're called to now. It's not just a time of old, it's a time of the present. So how do we build this radical community today? And again, it's just start small. Small is sacred. Open the door, share the meal, send the text message. Can I pray for you? Because Jesus modeled this with Bartimaeus in Mark 10. He heard him cry out and he stopped. And even though he knew that the man was blind, Jesus asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" And that's what dignity actually sounds like. It's listening. It honors the voice and it asks instead of assuming. And I guess here's some tangible sort of gap closing, I guess you can call it, actions. It could be personal, it could be community, or you can be systematic. So on the personal level, obviously, who's lonely, go out there, invite them. But communally, our churches, our businesses, our schools, are we building spaces where people feel invited in? And are we creating systems that can support those that are hurting? Are we advocating for policies that reflect God's goodness in everything that they do? Are we collaborating across sectors? Because I've worked with nonprofits for a lot of years. It is, like I said, with the pro-life movement, there is a need for a focus, a silo, as you will, but we need to bridge gaps between sectors because needs aren't made in a vacuum. You can have someone that's trafficked, that has a child with disabilities, that has housing crisis. Dignity doesn't live in those silos because people don't live in them. So I just want to point out, like, there is something at stake. We can all look around at our culture and things have just been breaking down in a way. I mean, I was born in the 80s and I can definitely see like massive shifts. And I don't know. So if we don't build systems and relationships that reflect inherent worth, we're going to remain in a culture that believes everything is negotiable. Everything is negotiable. Life remains a matter of convenience. Porn, trafficking remain normalized and commonplace. Euthanasia becomes framed as compassion, as we're rapidly seeing, and dignity becomes a privilege instead of a birthright. And again, another Bible verse I want to tie in right now is Micah 6:8. It says, quote, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And that's the roadmap that God has laid out for us in this movement that is pro-dignity. And we need to cast a vision together. If every policy, every interaction, every community initiative begins with the question, does this affirm the God-given dignity of every person that's involved? That's the world we're building that's rooted in God's goodness. Now, short of eternity, is this going to ever look perfect? Absolutely no. Because the only thing that is actual true redemption is through Christ our Lord. But we are called to cast that vision of God's purpose that the Bible reflects into our lives and out into reality while we're on this side of eternity. And it starts with us. We have a responsibility as the church, as individuals. And if you've been walking through with us through season 2, thank you. I actually really genuinely appreciate you not looking away from these really hard topics, because a lot of times we get this ostrich syndrome. We're overwhelmed by all the things we see. There's so much being informed, like too much information. And I really, really understand how much we as a culture sometimes just need to turn off hard things because we're just inundated all the time. And because I understand how easy that is, I really am very deeply grateful that you are here and that you're rooting yourselves in the solution that is God's solution. And I do want to bring this to a next step, because we don't just believe in dignity, we believe in being the person who is living it. And I would really like to partner with you. And even if it's just sharing this episode with somebody else, if you want to become a monthly donor to Dignity Defense, you can go on dignitydefense.org. And even if it's $5, like, that makes a big difference. There's also a link in the description that you can support the actual show. Obviously, same thing, $5, it helps. It really does. And it really just helps us as an organization to not just continue this education, but also to equip those that are really struggling, and also to empower our legislative process to uphold dignity at every level. And at the end of the day, like I said many times, human dignity is either inherent and equal or it isn't. And if it is, we're responsible for defending it. And I feel like if you're here, you're a part of it. So again, pro dignity, no doubt. Until next season, keep standing and sacrificing and believing in the sacred, holy image of every human soul. Thanks.